Historical records across multiple early civilizations indicate that accusations of adultery, particularly against women, were rarely treated as private disputes. Instead, they were absorbed into broader systems of governance, morality, and social order. Royal courts, as the highest instruments of authority, played a decisive role in defining, investigating, and punishing such accusations. Surviving legal codes and administrative records suggest that these proceedings were less concerned with individual relationships and more closely tied to questions of lineage, property, and political stability. In many early state societies, including those of Mesopotamia, adultery was understood primarily as an offense against male authority rather than a mutual breach of trust between spouses. The legal framework, preserved in the Code of Hammurabi, dating to the 18th century BCE, reveals a system in which a married woman accused of adultery could face severe consequences, often determined through formal judicial processes. These proceedings were typically overseen by appointed judges operating under royal authority, indicating that such cases were considered matters of public concern. Legal provisions describe how both the accused woman and her alleged partner could be subjected to punishment, including death by drowning, though conditional clauses allowed for mitigation if the husband chose to pardon his wife. Contemporary interpretations of these laws suggest that the royal court's involvement served to reinforce a rigid social hierarchy. Women's sexuality was closely linked to questions of inheritance and legitimacy, especially in societies where property and political authority were passed through male lineage. An accusation of adultery, therefore, carried implications that extended beyond the individuals directly involved. It introduced uncertainty into systems that depended on clearly defined familial structures, making state intervention not only likely but, in many cases, necessary from the perspective of ruling authorities. Administrative tablets recovered from cities such as and Mari suggest that accusations were sometimes investigated through testimony, oath-taking, and ritualized ordeals. The so-called ordeal by water, referenced in several texts, required the accused to enter a river under the supervision of officials. Survival was interpreted as evidence of innocence, while drowning confirmed guilt. Scholars have noted that such practices reflect a fusion of legal procedure and religious belief, where divine judgment was invoked to resolve cases lacking clear evidence. In ancient Egypt, surviving legal documentation is less explicit, but still provides insight into how such accusations were managed within elite and royal circles. While Egyptian law did not produce a codified system comparable to that of Mesopotamia, records from the New Kingdom period suggest that adultery cases could be handled through a combination of local adjudication and intervention by higher authorities. Papyrus documents and court records indicate that penalties ranged from corporal punishment to social ostracism, depending on the severity of the case and the social status of those involved. The position of women in ancient Egyptian society has often been characterized as comparatively more autonomous than in neighboring cultures, yet accusations of adultery still carried significant risks. Royal court involvement appears to have been more pronounced in cases involving members of the elite or individuals connected to temple institutions. In such contexts, the accusation could intersect with concerns about political loyalty and the integrity of administrative networks. Surviving evidence suggests that investigations might include witness testimony and formal inquiries conducted by officials acting under royal directive. In the context of the Hittite Empire, legal texts dating to the 2nd millennium BCE reveal a somewhat different approach. The Hittite laws, preserved on clay tablets, outline a range of scenarios involving adultery and prescribe varying penalties depending on circumstances. Notably, these laws often allowed for negotiation between the parties involved. In certain cases, if a husband chose to pardon his wife and her alleged partner, execution could be avoided. This conditional framework indicates that while the state maintained ultimate authority, it also recognized the role of familial decision-making within the judicial process. However, this flexibility did not necessarily translate into equitable treatment. The legal language consistently places the burden of accusation and consequence more heavily on women. Scholars analyzing these texts have argued that such asymmetry reflects broader patriarchal norms embedded within the political structure of the Hittite state. Royal courts, in this context, functioned as arbiters that balanced codified law with practical considerations, including alliances, property arrangements, and social cohesion. In ancient South Asia, early legal traditions preserved in texts associated with the Manners and Riti provide further evidence how accusations of adultery were integrated into systems of governance. These texts, while not strictly legal codes in the modern sense, influenced judicial practices and social expectations. They outline a hierarchy of penalties that varied according to caste, gender, and social status. Women accused of adultery could face severe punishment, including public humiliation, physical penalties, or exile, depending on the circumstances. Interpretations of these prescriptions suggest that royal courts played a role in enforcing such norms, particularly in urban centers and administrative hubs. Historical analyses indicate that the enforcement of moral codes was closely tied to the maintenance of social order, which was itself a central concern of early state formation. Accusations of adultery, therefore, were not treated in isolation, but as part of a broader regulatory framework governing behavior, hierarchy, and authority. Across these diverse civilizations, a consistent pattern emerges in which the adjudication of adultery accusations served multiple functions. It reinforced existing power structures, clarified social boundaries, and demonstrated the reach of royal authority into the most intimate aspects of daily life. Surviving documents suggest that the process was often formalized, involving officials, witnesses, and, in some cases, ritual practices intended to invoke divine oversight. Chroniclers and legal scholars have noted that while men could also be accused of adultery, the consequences they faced were frequently less severe or more easily mitigated. This disparity reflects underlying assumptions about gender roles and the perceived importance of controlling female sexuality within patriarchal systems. Royal courts, as institutions, did not merely reflect these assumptions, but actively enforced them through codified penalties and procedural norms. The involvement of the state in such cases also underscores the limited distinction between private and public spheres in ancient societies. Marriage, reproduction, and household management were deeply intertwined with economic and political structures. An accusation of adultery could disrupt alliances, affect inheritance rights, and challenge the legitimacy of heirs. As a result, it became a matter of concern for governing authorities, who sought to manage these risks through legal intervention. Surviving evidence further suggests that the experience of women accused of adultery varied significantly depending on their social status. Elite women, particularly those connected to royal households, might be subject to more formalized investigations, but also had access to networks of influence that could affect outcomes. In contrast, women of lower status often faced more immediate and severe consequences, with fewer opportunities to contest accusations. In examining these systems, it becomes clear that the treatment of women accused of adultery in royal courts was shaped by a complex interplay of law, religion, and political necessity. The procedures and penalties documented in surviving records reflect not only moral judgments, but also strategic considerations about maintaining order and authority. These dynamics reveal the extent to which personal conduct was regulated as part of a broader effort to sustain the stability of early states, where even the most private actions could carry public consequences. In the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly within the city-states of ancient Greece, the treatment of women accused of adultery reveals a different but equally structured relationship between private conduct and public authority. Surviving legal speeches and philosophical texts suggest that while cases were often initiated by husbands or male guardians, the authority to judge and enforce penalties ultimately rested within civic institutions closely aligned with state power. In classical Athens, adultery, referred to as moichia, was understood not merely as a violation of marital trust, but as a disruption of the household's integrity, which was itself a foundational unit of the polis. Legal orators such as Demosthenes provide indirect evidence of how such accusations were framed and prosecuted. His surviving speeches suggest that a husband who discovered his wife in an adulterous act was legally permitted to kill the male partner under certain circumstances, a provision that underscored the seriousness of the offense. However, when cases were brought before formal courts, the process involved structured argumentation, witness testimony, and appeals to established law. The accused woman, by contrast, often lacked a direct voice in these proceedings, as her legal identity was typically represented through a male guardian. Contemporary analyses of Athenian law indicate that penalties for women accused of adultery included social exclusion, prohibition from participating in religious ceremonies, and in some cases, divorce enforced by the husband. These outcomes suggest that the court's role extended beyond immediate punishment to the long-term regulation of social participation. Exclusion from religious rites, in particular, carried significant implications, as such activities were central to civic identity and communal cohesion. In the Roman world, the integration of adultery into state-controlled legal systems became even more explicit, particularly during the reign of Augustus. The enactment of the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coascendis in the late 1st century BCE formalized adultery as a public crime subject to state prosecution. Surviving legal texts and historical accounts indicate that this legislation marked a shift from private adjudication towards centralized enforcement, reflecting broader efforts by the imperial administration to regulate moral behavior as part of its governance strategy. Under this legal framework, a married woman accused of adultery could be brought before a court, where the case would be examined by magistrates operating under imperial authority. The law prescribed penalties, including exile and confiscation of property, with specific provisions determining the extent of punishment based on the circumstances. Fathers were granted certain rights to punish daughters accused of adultery, including, under narrowly defined conditions, the authority to execute them. Husbands, while still central to the process, were increasingly required to report the offense to authorities rather than resolve it privately. Surviving writings from Roman historians such as Tacitus suggest that these laws were not always applied uniformly. Elite women, particularly those connected to influential families, might face trials that were as much political as they were legal. Accusations of adultery could intersect with rivalries within the imperial court, where personal conduct became a means of negotiating power. In such cases, the judicial process reflected the priorities of the ruling class, with outcomes shaped by considerations that extended beyond the immediate facts of the case. Further east, in early imperial China, legal codes from dynasties, such as the Han period, provide additional insight into how accusations of adultery were managed within highly centralized bureaucratic systems. These codes, preserved in historical compilations and administrative records, outline detailed procedures for investigation and punishment. Women accused of adultery were subject to interrogation, often conducted by local magistrates whose authority derived from the imperial courts. The process emphasized confession and corroborating evidence, reflecting a legal culture that prioritized documentation and administrative order. The Confucian framework that underpinned much of Chinese governance placed a strong emphasis on hierarchical relationships and familial duty. Within this context, adultery was seen as a violation of both moral and social order. Legal provisions indicate that punishment could include corporal penalties, forced labor, or, in severe cases, execution. However, the application of these penalties was influenced by factors such as social rank, the presence of mitigating circumstances, and the discretion of officials responsible for adjudication. Historical records suggest that imperial authorities viewed the regulation of sexual conduct as integral to maintaining stability within the family unit, which was itself considered the foundation of the state. As a result, cases involving adultery were not treated as isolated incidents, but as potential disruptions to a broader system of governance. The involvement of magistrates and the requirement for formal documentation reflect an effort to standardize responses and ensure that outcomes aligned with established legal principles. In the Persian Empire, particularly during the Achaemenid period, surviving evidence is more fragmentary, yet classical sources and administrative records provide some indication of prevailing practices. Greek historians, such as Herodotus, describe a society in which royal authority extended deeply into matters of personal conduct, especially among the elite. While these accounts must be approached with caution due to potential bias, they suggest that accusations of adultery within the royal court could carry significant political implications. Royal women, including queens and members of the extended court, were subject to scrutiny that reflected their proximity to power. Allegations of infidelity could raise questions about succession and legitimacy, making them matters of state concern. In such contexts, the response to accusations was likely determined by a combination of legal norms and the strategic interests of the ruling authority. Punishments, where recorded, appear to have been severe, though the precise mechanisms of adjudication remain less clearly documented than in other civilizations. Across these regions, a recurring theme is the degree to which accusations of adultery were embedded within systems of governance that sought to regulate behavior in service of broader political objectives. Royal courts and their associated institutions function not only as venues for justice, but also as instruments for reinforcing social hierarchies and maintaining control over populations. The procedures employed whether involving formal trials, administrative inquiries, or ritualized ordeals, reflect a shared concern with preserving order in societies where lineage, property, and authority were closely intertwined. Surviving documents and historical analyses indicate that the experiences of women accused of adultery were shaped by a combination of legal structures and social expectations that consistently placed them in a vulnerable position. The asymmetry in how accusations were handled compared to those involving men underscores the extent to which gender roles were codified within these systems. Royal courts, in exercising their authority, did not operate in isolation, but as part of a network of institutions that collectively defined and enforced the boundaries of acceptable conduct. The long-term effects of these practices can be traced in the persistence of legal and cultural norms that continued to influence later societies. The integration of moral regulation into state governance, as seen in these early examples, established precedents that would be adapted and reinterpreted over time. Historical records suggest that while the specific forms of punishment and procedure evolved, the underlying principle that personal behavior could be subject to public authority remained a consistent feature of many legal traditions. In later antiquity and the transition into early medieval governance systems, the treatment of women accused of adultery continued to reflect the long-standing entanglement between private morality and state authority. In the Eastern Roman or Byzantine tradition, legal codes compiled under the reign of Justinian provide some of the most systematically preserved legal frameworks of the period. Codex Justinianus and associated legal compilations formalized adultery as a criminal offense with clearly defined procedures, penalties, and jurisdictional authority, reinforcing the idea that such matters were not solely domestic disputes, but issues of imperial governance. Within this system, accusations of adultery against women were processed through formal legal channels, often requiring written complaint and sworn testimony. The involvement of state-appointed judges reflects a continuation of earlier imperial practices, but with increased bureaucratic structure. Punishments varied depending on rank and circumstance, but surviving legal provisions indicate that exile, forced entry into convent-like institutions, and confiscation of property were among the measures employed. In some cases, physical punishment was also prescribed, though its application appears to have been regulated by legal limitation rather than discretionary violence alone. Contemporary legal commentary preserved in Byzantine legal tradition suggests that the regulation of marital conduct was closely linked to concerns about inheritance, legitimacy, and household stability. As in earlier Roman practice, control of female sexuality was treated as a mechanism for ensuring clarity in lineage and property transmission. Court, therefore, functioned as an adjudicative space where private behavior was assessed through the lens of public consequence. Legal interpretation emphasized not only the act itself, but its implications for social order. In parallel developments in early Islamic governance systems, legal traditions derived from the Quranic framework and subsequent juristic interpretation also addressed accusations of adultery, known in legal terminology as zina. Historical legal manuals compiled by jurists in the early centuries of Islamic governance indicate that evidentiary standards were stringent, requiring either direct testimony from multiple witnesses or confession under specific conditions. This high threshold for proof suggests an attempt to balance moral regulation with procedural restraint. In practice, accusations that reached formal adjudication were handled by judges operating within established legal schools. The emphasis on evidence reflects a broader concern with preventing false accusation, which itself was treated as a serious offense. Surviving legal writings indicate that punishment, when legally established, could be severe, including corporal penalties, though implementation varied across regions and periods, depending on administrative authority and local governance structures. Across these later systems, royal or imperial courts continue to serve as central institutions in defining and enforcing standards of conduct. However, the increasing formalization of legal procedure introduced greater emphasis on documentation, testimony, and codified rules. This shift reflects a broader evolution in state governance, where authority was increasingly exercised through structured legal mechanisms rather than ad hoc judgment alone. Historical analyses of these developments suggest that while procedural differences existed across regions, the underlying social logic remained consistent. Accusations of adultery were deeply connected to concerns about lineage, inheritance, and the stability of family structures, which were foundational to political organization. As a result, Legal systems consistently prioritized the regulation of marital fidelity as part of broader efforts to maintain order. In examining the cumulative evidence across ancient and late antique civilizations, a pattern emerges in which women accused of adultery occupied a structurally vulnerable position within legal frameworks. This vulnerability was not incidental, but embedded in the assumptions underlying property rights, familial authority, and political legitimacy. Royal and imperial courts operated as mechanisms through which these assumptions were enforced, translating social norms into legal outcomes. At the same time, surviving records indicate that these systems were not entirely uniform or static. Variations in procedure, evidentiary standards, and sentencing reveal that local context, administrative discretion, and political considerations could influence outcomes. In some cases, elite status or familial connections could mitigate punishment, while in others, political instability or factional struggle could intensify it. Judicial process was therefore both structured and contingent, shaped by the interaction between law and power. Archaeological findings, including legal papyri, court records, and administrative correspondence from regions such as the Byzantine Empire and earlier Roman provinces, support the interpretation that legal proceedings were often meticulous in form, even when outcomes varied. These documents reveal a consistent effort to record testimony, cite legal precedent, and formalize decisions, underscoring the administrative sophistication of these systems.